You believe in ghosts? A lot of people out there don't. And in today's video, the story that we're going to get into is about a guy who he didn't believe in ghosts, and then he found out the hard way that they were real, but at the end of the day, he really wishes that he did not know the truth. That is coming up in today's video. Hello everyone, and welcome to JNR Exploration and Discovery. I'm Jared, the J and the JNR. How would you feel if you had undeniable proof that ghosts are real? And how would you feel if the ghost lets you know that they were real? There are a lot of people out there that are skeptics. There's a lot of people out there who do not believe until something either really bad happens to them, or they start experiencing things that are just out of this world. And that is what happened for Stephen in today's story. Now, Stephen was a real skeptic. He was a non-believer in the paranormal, and he really did not believe in ghosts until strange occurrences started happening to him, and we'll get into that in today's video. But even years after all this happened, Stephen is still haunted by the nightmares of what happened to him, and in May 2001, he has 3 children, and he was a single father at this time, and he needed to find a place for his family to live. So the lease on their apartment was up, and they were about to find themselves homeless. At the end of the day, though, guys, he really wanted to find a place for him and his 3 kids to live, because anybody out there that's a single parent, they really know that it's really hard if you don't have a place for you and your children to stay, or if it's a little bit cramped at the time. So the story continues that he had actually answered a rental call, is what it would be called. They actually posted it in the papers, and it was in Union, Missouri, for a house for rent. It was added in the newspapers, and it was really intriguing. And it was a woman that was actually telling him about a house that she had owned, and she wanted somebody to rent it from her because she wanted to keep it, but she wanted to rent it out to other people. It was a large old place, and it was in very good shape. She invited Stephen to an open house, and it was on a Sunday. When Sunday rolled around, Stephen and his daughter, and they could barely believe their eyes once they rolled up to the house, they saw glorious wallpaper, old school. The house was just beyond beautiful whenever they got up there, and they could not believe that she was actually wanting to rent this out, and she wasn't actually living in the house herself. Now, as they continued on, there were other spectators there as well, and they were trying to rent the house for themselves, and they were going through, and they really didn't think that they had a chance to get it, but Stephen went ahead and filled out the rental application officially before the open house began for the house to be rented out. So he was really just trying to get a jump start on everything. The house had 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, and a large family kitchen with a mudroom that led to the back door. Upstairs, the breezeway was accessible to both bedrooms, and the basement had been used as a fruit cellar. It was more house than they had ever imagined for the price that they would be able to get, and they immediately knew that they had to have it. And so the biggest thing that drew him to the house was the fact that he was in a smaller apartment and he had 3 children, so they really needed a lot more space. There was a steady stream of potential renters. Yet again, though, guys, there's people there that had more money than Stephen. There were people there that had all kinds of things going for them, but Stephen just knew that they had to have this house. So once again, they filled out the rental application before anybody else got the opportunity to, and the old lady actually asked them, did he like the house and everything, and he just said, oh, it's astonishingly beautiful. And the old lady actually asked him, do they know how to take care of a house that's this old and the kind of upkeep that it would actually need? And as it goes on, though, something was a little bit odd about this woman, and Stephen notice this right away, but he tended to ignore these types of things, especially since the kind of house that they were looking at was just unbelievable. But it wasn't your typical real estate agents as the house showing was getting shown around. A week or two later, though, the landlady had actually called and told Stephen that he had actually ended up with the house. And they were so thrilled that they started pecking immediately. And they actually met at a restaurant to sign the papers. So the lady that was wanting to sign the papers on the house, though, she did not want to meet at the house, and Stephen found that to be a bit odd. They actually met at a restaurant that was actually down the road from it, so that was something that Stephen found really odd, especially since it was like, well, they're going to be living there, and so sign the papers. So as the story continues on, though, they were a little disappointed about not meeting at the house. Stephen really was disappointed that he wasn't going to be meeting her at the house because he just wanted to see this house again because he just thought it was so beautiful. It was a piece of history and just loved that. So they met at the pizza restaurant and they signed the landlady's papers, and the excitement was just too much to bear. Now, it seemed like it took forever for Stephen and them to be able to move, but once the moving date finally came, they moved in quite a hurry. Now, the moving truck actually passed the house whenever they're going to move because they're just kind of in awe. They kind of passed it by. But the strangest thing about this house is that there were actually people that would pass by the old house and they would actually slow down. And this was shortly after they moved in. It would actually slow down in front of the house and then they would speed back up until they got past it. And one day, Stephen's daughter was actually out on the porch and actually said to her dad, Dad, well, watch this. Nobody wanted to walk in front of the house. They'd go down the sidewalk. About the time they got to the front of the house, they would cross over to the other side of the road and they would go on down and they would go down the other side of the road. So Stephen found this to be quite strange at this point. The first night that they stayed in that old house was very uneventful, and looking back, Stephen thought that this could be because the house might have wanted to draw them in and actually make them feel comfortable there, so that way they could be comfortable enough there to where they could be there. And energy feeds spirits, so it's something that really, if they really want you there, they won't do anything at first because they want you to settle down and become comfortable before they start doing everything, especially poltergeist activity. So as they go on, a few days later, the first incident occurred after they moved into the old house. So there was a hanging large picture of two angels in the living room after Stephen's daughter had actually suggested that it complemented the wallpaper in the house very nicely. The ceiling was also complemented nicely by this because it was old. It had these great molding and carvings on the wall. It was just a fantastic house all the way around. Stephen turned to walk away, and then crash. The picture came crashing down off of the wall that he just hung up. It fell to the floor, and he rehung it, and he turned away, only for it to fall again. Stephen had rehung this picture, and he hung it up for a third time, and he walked away. And he felt the rush of air hit the back of his ankles. He thought, what the hell is going on here? I mean, guys, at this point, if you keep hanging this picture up and it keeps throwing itself off the wall, you would probably think, what the hell is going on as well? So he turned, and just to see the picture laying at his feet, more determined than ever, he hung the picture up again and then shouted, "Stay there, damn it." He wanted the picture to stay on the wall, and honestly, guys, I think we can all agree that he would want it to stay there. I mean, we would all want it to stay there because that would be getting very annoying if this thing kept falling off the wall. Anybody that actually has tried to set something up and it fell off again knows the annoyance of that. He was talking, and the kids thought that he was talking to them, but the kids were nowhere around. But he really felt like there was somebody else around him as well. He felt like there was a presence right there. The kids were out playing on the front porch though, but he felt like that they were standing right there behind him or next to him at this point. And At that point is the exact point, like what I was talking about, is where they noticed that the people would not walk in front of the house. So after the first poltergeist activity started in the house, that's when they really had problems with this old house. And the Sunday after all that poltergeist activity had started, they had actually returned from church excited, and they had set aside the whole day to work in the yard. And this was a big deal for them because back at their old apartment, they did not have space or anything, so being able to do yard work and everything was a big deal. It was something that was extraordinary for them because they had all that extra space that they could deal with. So they mowed the grass, they raked the leaves, they did all that good stuff. And then he asked his younger son and down to the basement to fetch the garden hose so they could clean the walkways and wash down the house and the white boards that were on the outside that were getting mighty dirty at this point. Only a minute or two had passed, and Stephen had heard the screams, and he ran frantically to go find his son, who he'd sent down into the basement to retrieve the garden hose. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor shaking, and he had peed his pants. So whatever he had seen at this point was something that had horrified him and had creeped him out beyond anything. Stephen yelled at his son and asked, "What's wrong? What happened?" And he said, "What chased you?" Because he could tell that his son had been running and frantic, and he was breathing heavily, and it was just something he could tell that he'd been doing that. And his son actually said after that he was being chased. Now, aside from that incident, they were incredibly happy in that house for the first few days especially. And they were making plans for gardening and decorating the house, and him and his sons, and they were just really having a good time. Keep in mind that the poltergeist activity, the pictures fell off the wall, and his son had had that experience, but outside of that, they hadn't had any other experiences up to this point. Now, the big thing is that summer was coming on, and this was his children's last week of classes, and on that Monday, they had all arrived after school, and to find every light in the house had been switched on. And they knew that all the lights in the house had been switched off. So Stephen's first impulse was to blame the children, who then they pleaded innocent with their father, saying that they didn't do it. And the same thing happened on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, on Friday. And on the next day, his daughter and his sons actually went out to the car, and they actually went out touring the house. Stephen actually went through the house to see if they had left any of the lights on. Now, that night when they returned home, they had actually found every light burning again. And at this point, Stephen had actually checked the house himself to make sure all the lights was off. But his children were out there in the car, so they couldn't have possibly been the ones inside the house that turned the lights back on. So at that point, they were a little creeped out. After they returned home, though, to find all those lights that were on, they had thought somebody had broken in, and they were trying to look for said person, but they never did find anybody. Stephen searched the rooms in a panic, though, because he thought, oh my goodness, there has to be somebody else in this house. And at this point, they realized that there wasn't, they were alone, or so they thought. So his daughter actually called from the living room to him, though, at this point, actually said that she was cold. And Stephen told her, he was like, "What are you talking about?" Because he was actually sweating. And when he stepped into the room of where they were, it dropped a good 30 degrees in this house. And that was the point of where Stephen, they didn't see anything, but they felt like something was definitely weird. And they actually felt like an electrical current was flowing through their bodies at this point. And they all got goosebumps. And Stephen was standing there thinking, what in the earth is going on, and what in the hell is going on around here? Because that's just something that a lot of people just would not deal well with, especially at that point, because you think somebody's in your house at this point. The following Sunday, they were sitting in the family room talking, and the kids had their backs to the kitchen. And something that Stephen is still thankful for to this day is what happens next actually still haunts him in his dreams to this day. He was getting ready to take a business trip the following mornings to Indianapolis, and his kids were watching TV and discussing plans for their stay at their grandparents' house. He noticed out of the first of his corner of his eye something moving, then standing in the kitchen doorway. Not really something that Stephen actually gave much thought to, but after everything else had been happening in the house, and then he noticed that it was a human shape, but it was just a shadow. It was a shadowy, dark, smoky figure, but it was in the shape of a human. And after a moment passed, he actually looked up, and the figure was still there, and began to move into the room, and the churning black smoke form stood there in the doorway for what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only there for a few moments. But when you have fear like that, you're going to definitely feel like it's going on a lot longer than what you think it is. And they have two choices. They could either run from the house at this point, or they could stay in the house. And Stephen had put every dime he had into that house to actually be able to get them to move over there. So they really didn't have a choice but to stay there. So his hands shook uncontrollably, and he said to himself, "We still have to leave, so we'll go quietly and orderly as if nothing was wrong." So he stood up, and he was shaking, and at the nicest, calmest voice he could use, he told his kids, "Let's go get a soda and go see Grandma." And at that point, it was when his youngest was instantly excited of the prospect of soda before bed, but the two others looked at Stephen as he had lost his mind. So his kids, one of them's excited about the soda, and the other one just thinks he's insane because, well, he's wanting them to go break all the rules that he always sets for them and everything. But thankfully, his keys were on the coffee table because he had actually thought that he left them upstairs, but thankfully they were right there so they could just grab them and head straight out the door. Now, as he turned back to lock the door, the image of that man, that smoky image that he had seen, was still right there, and the dogs had actually began barking at this point because it was such a loud noise coming from inside his house, between the banging and the screaming and just all kinds of things going on in his house, but there was nobody in there at this point. So then, at this point, they haven't got in the car yet, but Stephen thought, the hell with this, and he told his kids to hurry up and get in the car so they could get out of that place. And it is still a blur to Stephen to this day, but he does remember his younger son was trembling with fright and said that was the monster that chased him in the basement that was standing in the upstairs window, and that was the same shadowy figure who Stephen had seen repeatedly out of the corner of his eye and seen him standing in the room right there. Now, at that night, they all stayed with Stephen's parents. And then early the next day, he gathered his things and left for his business trip. By the time he got back and picked up the kids, it had been a whole week had gone by at this point. And again, he had been thinking about this the whole time he was gone on his business trip. Where else would Stephen and his family go at this point? Again, he had all the money tied up in there. He really didn't want to stay with his parents. He was just having all kinds of things. But what happened next was a terrible encounter. His parents actually agreed it would be a good idea to call the old landlady and ask straightforward questions about the house and its former occupants. And at that point, he was able to reach her, and he chose his words carefully and asked in the most polite way that he could whether the previous tenants had perhaps mentioned to go. She answered, "Not that I can remember." And at this point is when she said that there had been a strange tenant, a girl, who had actually lived and claimed that her dead father came to visit her in that old house. But the girl had left some stuff behind the shed as well. But the landlady could never get her to come pick it up. So this girl was also afraid to come back to that house. Now, the next thing that you have to keep in mind about this story is that other people had also left their belongings at this house. Other people who had lived there because they had left fleeing in the middle of the night, and all their items have been kept there. So, and as this continued on, poltergeist activity will usually start, and it just continue to get worse and worse and worse as you go, and that's what they were dealing with here. So at this point, not much more than a year had actually gone by, and he had actually been living in this house at a year at this point. Stephen and his family had. It's a long time to stay in a haunted house. It really is. The next Sunday, it came and went with no trouble, and he was convincing himself that they had gone through was just a one-time ordeal, and it wasn't going to happen again. But everything changed on the following day, and whenever it happened, he was on the phone with his mother, and the kids inside the house rattled. I paused to listen. Stephen was listening as they rattled, and at that point his kids were just playing before he could scold again, his daughter's voice actually cut him off and said, "Daddy, I'm in here reading and my brothers are asleep." So the next thing that he could remember, the temperature in the room he was in dropped instantly by at least 30 degrees. So not walking into a room was dropping 30 degrees, but the temperature in the room he was in dropped by 30 degrees. The big thing to remember at this point, though, is that Stephen had all kinds of horrible things happening up to this point. But they kind of stopped, but now they were happening again. I shouted into the phone as Stephen shouted into the phone at his mother. And at that point, she had actually made plans to meet them at the house on top of the street of the hill of where they lived at. So the whole house began to shake, and as they were coming from upstairs and downstairs, the house was going boom, 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 boom. And as they were going, the screaming of a man over and over, and her daughters screaming. Stephen's daughters began to screaming, and his sons also began to scream. And one of the two bedroom doors led to the stairs, and at that point, Stephen knew he had to go rescue his children. The floor beneath Stephen was shaking, and as he made his way up to the opposite bedroom, he felt something behind him, but didn't want to turn around. When he made it to the door, it wouldn't open. Screaming, Stephen threw himself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Tried again and again until it flew open. He told his older son to get his brother and run out of the front door to the car, but his shocked daughter would not move. A slap made her respond. Sometimes that's just something that people have to do to get people to snap out of it if they're having a very bad moment and they're just terrified. And he actually just grabbed her, and they were out the door. And they jumped into the car, and you could still hear the angry noises coming from the house. And as they sped away and parked over by the house on top of the hill, waiting for his parents, they peered back at the old house, and his children and him could see the blackness moving methodically through the house, and it seemed like it was searching for them. And at this point, that was their last night in that old house, and his children never returned, and he only returned a handful of times to actually get the few belongings that they still had left back at the house. But he never returned by himself, and he just got the remainder of their belongings, and he got out of there. Nobody ever joked around, and they actually developed an image that they had taken down in the basement the day that they actually went back to move out the remaining stuff. His brother-in-law had actually came with him and actually ended up taking pictures and ended up finding a old shattered baby remain, and they were later doing some research, and they actually found that it was that house actually belonged to an old Civil War soldier, and that's the image that they see in the photo that they took, that they actually took a long time. Now, there was something that actually happened to this, though. There was about a year ago, that an acquaintance of Stephen's actually saw a police car race up to the old house one night and then watched a family running out of the door and their night clothes. After that, the old lady turned the place into a dog kennel because nobody wanted to live in this haunted house. Just imagine that. All this poltergeist activity, and they do not want to live there. It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? As that happened, though, they turned it into a dog kennel, and they drive past that old house every now and then. Whenever Stephen gets up enough nerve, he feels like, sure, he'll drive by it today, but very, very unlikely that he'll actually have enough nerve to drive by that place. And still to this day, though, it haunts his nightmares, and it haunts his very being of things that happened in that house. Something to remember, though, guys, is that this guy right here, this is the guy that Stephen was seeing. This is the picture, and this is the picture that they found of that old Civil War gentleman that they had actually taken. It was the same exact face, same exact person, same exact everything. Hope you guys enjoyed today's story, and hopefully we'll continue to do more. Hopefully they'll continue to get better as we go. I know today's story was kind of long, and it was definitely getting very long, but as these stories, I try to break them down and paraphrase them as best I can. But all these stories are true, and they're from the perspective of people that's actually experienced this. And until you've actually experienced something, you really can't say what's real and what's not real. So at the end of the day, guys, don't judge people. And if you experience yourself, then you'll actually see how mystifying, horrifying, or anything else that this stuff can be for people. So just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean that it's not real.